here's a problem that I face, and this is, I think, one of the hardest things that a lot of people face when they get into. So we talked about starting. So you got your everything set up, you've got an idea or two, and you're so enthusiastic about it, you're so jazzed, you love it, you think the audience is going to love it, and then you sit down and you either write it or you draw it, and you
Yeah.
start to realize, oh man, I have, 22 more pages to fill up, and I've already shot my wad on this idea. Now what? You know what I mean? Like, that is a
Yeah.
problem that I face a lot. So I'm curious to know your take on how you handle that, because I know when I do it, it's really I'm a get into the weeds kind of guy. I like to start examining the conflict of what's going on out of that idea. It's like, okay, here's my idea. So this creates a problem that this character has to solve. Well, in order to solve it, they need to have this tool. How do they get that tool? How does that tool work? Does the tool do this? Where's the tool hidden? Do they have to get through this to get to that tool?
Right.
It's almost like a video game in my head where I start breaking down levels where it's like, oh, you got to go backwards from the idea and then work towards the idea. And then after it's like, okay, he just killed the bad guy. Now what? What happens? There's no more conflict. Well, what if this person shows up and they're pissed off that they killed you know what I mean? Like, it's
Yeah.
starting to examine the fallout of that conflict. Like, I really start fleshing out the itty bitty details of any kind of idea that I have, just because I have to fill in more time. But I also feel like it makes it more, and this is important in film. And one day I'll go into more detail about this in a different podcast. But realism, not so much realism. They'd call it the suspension of disbelief, but it's really just about immersing your characters in a believable world. It doesn't have to be real, it just has to be
Yeah.
believable within that world. So I feel like if I flesh that stuff out, then the ideas that, however crazy and far out that they may be, I have fleshed out how they happen, why they happen, when they happen, who they happen to, what happens because of it, etc. And that seems to fill a lot of the voids for me in terms of it. And then I like also when I have two different bullet points of two crazy disconnected ideas that I've thought up, like, oh, this house explodes, but then this girl turns into a turtle. Like, that's never anything that I've ever written. But somehow in filling out the void of how she turned into a turtle, I can somehow catch a line where I can connect that to the house blowing up. And that's when the magic is for me. When I start putting things together, and usually that's when I start realizing whatever the subconscious theme of the
Yeah.
story I was trying to tell is
Yeah.
starts coming to the surface in my head. And then once I realize that, I'm like, oh, this is about relationships. This is about love. This is about forgiveness, whatever the theme may be. And then I start looking at the other ideas that I might have posted up on the board. And I'm like, okay, how do I pull love or forgiveness out of that action sequence that I just wrote? He's shooting at a guy on top of a train. How do I milk that for the theme of
Yeah.
forgiveness? You know what I mean? Like, and that's where I start, like, again, that momentum, that rolling, that's how I start flowing. So I'm curious to know what it is that you do when you have to fill those voids.
Good. That's a
I
very
know I
good
just filled the
question.
whole void by my rant. I was hoping you would
Um
come with an answer in that time, but it's still a very difficult question or to answer.
well, that's usually when I go towards we had talked about this in a previous podcast about like having ideas for other like for other
Oh yeah,
projects.
right.
That's usually when I pull into the toolbox of like, oh, what are other things that I was going to use for other projects? Like, because I'm now taking this mentality lately of, I'm not going to worry about that later project. It may never happen. Let's use it right now. Like, now's the
Good idea.
time because I could be dead or something. You know what I mean? Like, the embracing the moment is more the thing to do, because or I might have better ideas later on that will totally outstrip whatever I had in my back pocket that I was like, waiting on to be this big thing later on. Like, don't worry about it. There'll be other ideas later on. And so that has been lately really helping me stay stay out of that zone of like being like, oh, I don't know what to do now. Granted, it does happen. So like I might, if I'm just like not sure what to do in the moment, I might walk away from the table for a second, you know? Like I might go do something else. That might be time for me to go exercise and wait for or meditate or whatever and wait for the new ideas to come in, which is not exactly useful help. I
No.
recognize, because I'm saying like, it'll just come to you like magic.